We live in a culture that's as afraid of mental illness as it is of spiritual experience. And I was neither religious or New Age, so trying to find a context and guidance and containment for those experiences was not very easy. Indigenous communities, quantum physicists, mystics, religious believers have long held the idea that we live simultaneously in two realities. These two realities could be framed as ordinary and non-ordinary reality, matter and energy, universe and cosmos, the world and the dream time, the explicate and the implicate order. They're different frequencies and functions of the same stuff. Some people call that stuff God, or spirit, or source, or the 0-point field. But either way, it's not separate, or supernatural, or something to be afraid of. It's actually our very nature. It's we in our limits who don't know how to read the world, or ourselves yet. We're like children who don't know how to decipher the alphabet, and so cannot read a book. Spiritual experience for me is simply an expanded bandwidth of perception that encompasses both these levels of reality, and sometimes reaches all the way into the source itself. Spiritual emergency is when that happens without a context or a story for it, or a guide or adequate containment. What could be a successful integrated initiation into larger self or reality becomes instead intensely traumatizing and terrifying, a failed initiation, as Joseph Campbell would say. So instead of leading to transformation, it actually ends up leading to fragmentation and, at times, annihilation. Fast forward to 27 and I had my first out-of-body experience. I was in an airport at the time, appropriately enough, and we'd had to evacuate because of a bomb scare. And I was sitting on a trolley outside when suddenly I was outside of my body and I'd moved to about 15 feet away and I was looking at my body, completely as if I was another person. And I felt a total calm come over me and a sort of almost sense of amusement that I'd slipped out. Somehow I knew it wasn't the rules of the game to do that. And all the fear had left me. Immediately I suddenly was back in my body and into that ravaging chemistry of total terror. I got on the plane very, very shaken and picked up the car from the airport when I landed and started to drive home. At the time I was writing a novel in a terribly remote, creepy village in Wales. And as I was driving in the fast lane, it was a bit like Inception. Suddenly the road disappeared and then the car disappeared and then my whole body disappeared. And I was just all this multicolored energy suspended. I wasn't even moving, nothing was moving. I was just suspended in empty space. And then there was a very sort of dim awareness that was like, get off the road. So I somehow willed my form enough to get over into the slow lane. And then I drove like a crazy person at 10 miles an hour till I got to an exit. And I went to A&E and had a brain scan because I thought I was having a brain hemorrhage. And they found nothing and suggested I go and see a psychiatrist. So I got back in the car, drove back to Wales, and all the time the road was disappearing, appearing, I was appearing, disappearing. And I got home and took a bottle of wine out the fridge and got into bed. And at that time there was no TV in the house and there was no internet, so all I had was books. And all my friends were 100 miles away. So I started reading Virginia Woolf, and she was writing about time and the unraveling of consciousness, and I started leaving my body again. So then I tried to read Conversations with God to get some sort of meaning to what was happening. And I read the line, "You're not the child of God, you are God." And that really tipped me over into a whole other thing. Basically, a friend had to come and pick me up, and I sat in a house for, well, it took several weeks of coming and going from my body. Unless someone was actually physically touching me, I would leave my body. And it was really, truly the most terrifying experience I've had in my life. I went and had 2 more brain scans, nothing got shown up. And it felt like I was on the ocean floor and I had the silvering cord of my breath. That was all that was holding me to reality. And it really took everything I had not to jump out of a window at that point. So 2 things really helped me. One was my friends. Again, very, very lucky. I had 2 gainfully unemployed friends at the time who could look after me. And they fed me, and they held me, and they made me laugh, and they tried to get me to watch Disney films, which frankly terrified me even more. Shrek used to make me sob. Everything felt so turned up, the noise, the sound. I'd be in the middle of the road and in front of traffic, and I just wouldn't even be able to get across the road. I wouldn't even understand what a road was. Words were complete nonsense, nothing connected. And for all I'd read and knew at that time, none of it helped. There was not one single idea that helped me through that. It was purely breathing and my friends. But the other crucial thing, and I think it's really relevant for spiritual emergencies, is how you frame it. And my friends obviously couldn't frame it. And I mean, my whole nervous system was totally short-circuited. And my whole architecture of myself was completely collapsed. There was no structure at all. And in the end, I went to do an apple harvest, actually. That really helped, being in nature. And I tried to find a therapist, and they were shit. They were so terrible, these therapists. None of them could navigate the body, and none of them could navigate anything spiritual. So the whole thing was framed as either psychosis or projection. I could see the visible fear in their eyes if I started talking about what was really going on. And that actually started to make me feel far madder than if I hadn't gone to see them. And it wasn't until I actually found an energy medicine practitioner who had used to be a therapist, who could actually start providing some frames for me, that's when the healing started. So over the next few years, I moved between spiritual and emotional stuff. I was still studying and going on long retreats in India and Nepal, but I was also very clear that until I've healed the kind of foundation of myself, that everything I was experiencing was just going to be passing through and fragments. That kind of carried on. I didn't have any major events, but I was still getting a lot of downloads and dreams and all of the lighter stuff until I was 33, which is 8 years ago. And then I had another really serious break with reality. And this was no less shocking, but now I had some maps and I had some guides and I had a stronger sense of self. I was getting published as a poet, I was training as a child therapist, and I was just starting to feel a little bit more real. So around this time, weird electrical stuff happened. If I was praying, the TV would turn on. If I walked into rooms, lights would turn on, radios would turn on, lights would flicker. And one night I had this lucid dream about an ex-boyfriend, and we had a whole conversation, and when I woke up in the morning I wrote it down. And that morning, for the first time in a year, he contacted me, and his email was word for word what had happened, he'd said to me in the dream. And I went online to look up quantum entanglement and dream telepathy and all that stuff. And whilst I was reading it, I heard this noise coming from my cupboard. And I looked up. It was so loud it made me look up. And I was just staring at the cupboard thinking, what is that? And it sounded like there was a bird trapped in the cupboard. It was whirring, frantic wings. And suddenly, a black bird that was kind of like a crow, but also kind of like a creatura, flew out of the cupboard door, the closed cupboard door, across my room and out of the wall. So I sat there and I was like, oh shit, I've gone mad. This is the mad. Because it wasn't a hallucination, it was as real as anything. It was completely, it wasn't solid, but it was like if I was going to say that was a hallucination, then I'd have to say everything was a hallucination. So basically, in that slight freak out, but also kind of excitement, to be honest, because it felt like the fabric was starting to shift and I was kind of interested in that. I had a voice, and I've never had a voice before or since, but I had a voice came into my head and said it's time to start training in energy. So that's what I did. I went on to train in energy medicine and shamanic work. And I have to say I was a pretty reluctant participant of a lot of those things because it's quite a weird scene. And in the middle of that process, I had another dream. And in my dreams, I have some spirit teachers. And one of them is 5 minutes, okay. One of them dresses up like a brothel madam in a bright red wig. and she always addresses me in jazz songs whilst smoking a cigarette. And she was teaching me how to read energy in the air. So she was showing me that this isn't air, this is actually an intelligent matrix of energy. And she was teaching me that when you look straight at things, you only see ordinary reality. When you soften your gaze and you look in, you see non-ordinary reality. And she used the metaphor of a magic eye picture. She used the metaphor of a magic eye picture. So where you're looking in to see the shape come out, rather than looking flat at it. So I woke up, and at the end of the dream she said, that's it, she's got it now. Woke up and I'd had a healing session booked for weeks, and I went to this healing session, and the practitioner chose out of thousands of words, emotions, body parts, all the rest of it. She chose eyes, and she chose corpus callosum, which is the bridge between the right and left hemisphere of the brain. And she did this healing on my eyes and my corpus callosum. And that night when I went to bed, I turned the light off and I screamed, because my whole room was not dark at all. It was full of the most extraordinary shimmering web of electrical, thrumming, whizzing light. And there were countless coloured orbs of light that was zooming around the room. And by my bed in a neat row were 3 humanoid, fully quite tall, white light beings. So obviously I slammed on the lights, and then I turned them off, and they were still there. And that went on for quite a long time. I asked them in a very English way, please, can you leave? And they didn't. And then I sort of thought by now I had enough context to know it was okay, that, you know, this wasn't, wasn't mad, this was happening, I was being shown it, so engage. So I got into bed and we started a kind of strange acquaintance. And over that year, every single night, I was grieving my father's death at the time, and still recovering from trauma, and I was pretty lonely at that time. And every night, the 3 beings would line up alongside my bed, and I could feel love just coming out of them to me. And these orbs, who were very playful, had a great sense of humour, would line up in a very long line all the way down my body, and they would stay there all night. It was like they were down my chakras, but I mean, there were more of them than the chakras. And it was, I don't know, it taught me absolutely that we're not alone. So that was sort of the big experience into non-ordinary reality in terms of actually starting to interact with it. But I really want to say, in terms of spiritual emergencies, if people have them, it is really important that you actually look at your emotional life as well as the spiritual. You know, there's no point in having a spiritual experience if you can't integrate it. And you won't be able to integrate it until you actually heal some pretty foundational stuff in yourself. Yeah, these days it's all become the same thing really, and the world is really a conversation now. It's alive from its own side, and it feels like a kind of magic show increasingly. And I think it's relevant for now because I do believe we're moving into a global shift. And I think just as the world is darkening, there's also a quickening that's happening. And a lot of people are starting to awaken out of ordinary consciousness. And the bandwidth of awareness is growing very, very fast for a lot of people. So, you know, with that, if you don't have a context and you don't have a guide and you don't have the containment, you are going to be a little bit unsteady in that if that's happening. So just be aware that there are people around, not enough, unfortunately, talking about it in a way that makes it actually quite normal, because it is actually quite normal. It's our birthright. We have just narrowed reality to such a tiny point that we can't even see that anymore. So I just think we're moving into a time where we're going to need ordinary miracles from ordinary people, and it's going to take all of us to save the situation we are in collectively. But that starts with starting to realise how powerful you are. Thank you.